Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Confucian idea of the Tao. That's the way the word is pronounced. It's sometimes spelled Tao in English, but it's pronounced as if with a D. And sometimes it is actually spelled phonetically Dao, Dao. Um, Confucius and Confucianism play an important role in the history of the Tao as a philosophical concept. The word literally means something like path or way or route. And that's borne out in some of the ways that philosophers talk about it, as I'll say momentarily. But Confucius is the first person we know of to have used the word metaphorically to mean something like the correct way of life, that the Tao is the right way to live. And there are three major ancient Confucian philosophers: Confucius himself, Mencius, and Shunzi. When we look, for example, at Shunzi, we often see very useful exploitations of the dual meanings of Tao. Again, that's the literal meaning of path and the metaphorical meaning of way of life. Shunzi will often talk about older sage kings as having provided markers on the Tao, or markers to help us identify the Tao. Just as, for example, when you're skiing or hiking, you'll notice markers or signage identifying for you which is the correct way and which ways to avoid. The word Tao takes on an incredibly expansive meaning in Taoism, where the Tao is something like the source of literally everything that and defies or attempts to put it in a box or categorize it either conceptually or linguistically. That's really not the case in Confucianism, where even though it does have a slightly expanded metaphorical meaning, it's still ultimately a meaning that's recognizable from its literal or base meaning. It's worthwhile to say something about the background of Confucius. Confucius lived in the spring and autumn period in ancient China. We don't know when exactly he lived, but some general dates we can give are around 551 BC to 479 BC. We know very little about his life, and it's not obvious that the text we have that is allegedly a collection of his sayings really does collect his sayings. The Analects, which is what this text is usually uh, translated as in English. A better translation might be something like the ordered sayings, and it's very likely that many of these sayings were just invented long after his life. But they do capture the spirit of early Confucianism and ancient Confucianism that were super important for later Confucian thinkers, such as Mencius and Shunzi. And although we don't really know a lot about his life, there is much that we can piece together from the time period he was in. His priorities as a thinker are reflected in what China was going through in the spring and autumn period, which, by the way, gets its name from the major historical primary text of the time, the Spring and Autumn Annals, which tell us about the spring and autumn period and what was going on in this period in Chinese history, which we usually call the Zhou period, after the Zhou dynasty that was in charge at the time. That's spelled Zhou in English. That's how the word is transliterated. And you can pronounce it different ways. Shu period, Zhu period. These are ways that I've heard this term pronounced by English speakers in academia at different points in time. Specifically, Confucius is writing, or living rather, in the what we call the Eastern Zhou period. So the spring and autumn period is subdivided. The spring and autumn period is a part of the Eastern Zhou period. When the Zhou dynasty has been forced by invaders from the west of China, has been forced to move east. And the Zhou dynasty is still active in this time. It won't be for very long after Confucius's death. The spring and autumn period eventually becomes the Warring States period, which, as its name suggests, is a period of great civil strife. But the Chinese thinkers at this time have to wrestle with a very big existential question, which is, well, why did we lose? Why did things go badly for us such that our Zhou dynasty had to move from the west to the east in the face of this in the face of invaders? And Confucius settles on this answer, which is that um, we had unsuccessfully practiced the way. We were not living in accordance with the way or the Tao, and that even when people had engaged in the right practices, they did not have the right mindset. That you might have had people who were going through the motions when it comes to important rituals, but that they were going through the motions for the wrong reasons. The the important Confucian idea that this gets on the table for us is that the correct Tao was one that we need to return to. So, for example, in Analects 1.9, we have this saying: take great care in seeing off the deceased and sedulously maintain the sacrifices to your distant ancestors, and the common people will sincerely return to virtue. Which literally, the word for virtue is da, which means something literally sort of like power. But in this case, it means virtue. And here's another saying. This is Analects 1.12. When it comes to the practice of ritual, it is harmonious ease that is to be valued. It is precisely such harmony that makes the way of the former king so beautiful. If you merely stick rigidly to ritual in all matters, great and small, there will remain that which you cannot accomplish. Yet if you know enough to value harmonious ease, but try to attain it without being regulated by the rights, this will not work either. There's a lot in that one, but the words that I want to focus on right now are way of the former kings. So the idea is that say previous sage kings had discovered the way, and now it's our job to return to them. So one of Confucius's missions, one of the most important parts of his project, um, as a philosopher, as a thinker, as a social critic, is to renew interest in the way and thereby serve heaven. And when we have secured this mandate of heaven, when we've secured heaven's permission or blessing, we will be able to rule without having invaders defeat us, without degenerating or deteriorating into civil strife. And he is generally pessimistic about his own time. Um, he's not pessimistic about our potential, but he's pessimistic um, about how likely it is that we will actually get back to the way and stay on it properly. We often lose propriety, properness with respect to the way due to human weakness, such as lust and greed. Um, but because humans are socially conditioned, we there is the power to get us back on the way. So, this following saying is an incredibly illustrative one in that respect. Analect 7.1 says, "I transmit rather than innovate. I trust in and love the ancient ways." What this passage means is that Confucius was not interested in innovating and creating a new way, And he wasn't even interested in creating a new way of getting back on the old way, but he sees himself and his mission as about renewing interest, about, as in, he is trying to point people back to social strategies that actually worked. The Confucian way is about living well now for us, but is also and primarily, in fact, about renewing interest in strategies that keep the entire fabric of society together and intact. Now, before we get to the details of the Confucian way, we should mention something about how we would actually get people back to this way. Confucius does not believe in the use of coercion to get people back to the way. Here is, for example, Analects 2.3. If you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves. The point there is that coercion causes bad results because it causes people to hate rulers. Uh, People and their governments should not have a relationship marked by animosity. And thus, instead, we should rule by example or lead by example. For example, this is Analects 2.10. Look at the means a man employs, observe the basis from which he acts, and discover where it is that he feels at ease. Where can he hide? Where can he hide? The idea is that we should be looking to other people because daily behavior and etiquette help to reveal our virtue. And this is Analect 2.1 or Analects 2.1. One who rules through the power of virtue is analogous to the pole star. It simply remains in place. It remains in its place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars. So the rulers should be like the pole star or the North Star, the sense that, well, everything else revolves around it. That the simply living in the correct way, you'll get what comes to you, so to speak. And for a ruler, what that means is that the correct institutions in place at the top will lead to correct institutions all the way down and correct behavior all the way down. That could feel a little optimistic, and there is something to be said about the optimism of that view. But it's important to note that a lot of this is grounded in very, very careful observations about the results that coercion brings. Because as far as Confucius is concerned, those are really the two options. It's coercion and this other way of life, which typically is called Wu Wei. That's WU-WEI, which Wu Wei, which means something like acting by inaction or not acting but acting. The idea is that it's supposed to sound sort of oxymoronic. You're acting but also not acting. So a good example of someone engaging in something Wu Wei here would be the way that I'm just going to take care of my own affairs in the correct manner, and simply by doing so, eventually, over enough time, other people will take notice of me and will see the way that things go well for me because I am taking correct care of my own affairs. Am I actually structuring your behavior? In a way I am, but in another way I'm not. And that's the idea of it being both inaction and action at the same time. I am not trying to structure your affairs, and I'm not straining myself to structure your affairs. But by showing you how to structure my own affairs and showing you the dividends this yields and the fruit that this yields, I am in a way actually giving you an example, right? And so this, for example, is Analects 1.1, 1.14. The gentleman is not motivated by the desire for a full belly or a comfortable abode. He is simply scrupulous in behavior and careful in speech, drawing near to those who possesses the way, those who possess the way, in order to be set straight by them. Surely this and nothing else is what it means to love learning. So the idea is that we're not going to care about external things like have food or health or shelter, but I'm just going to take care of my own things, be scrupulous in my own behavior, careful in speech, and part of that does mean, as 1.14 says, is that like, yeah, if I'm doing something wrong, I'm going to make sure that I'm with people who could properly set me straight, but that I'm not going to be super concerned with straining myself to bring other people in line myself. And again, we want to apply that lesson to rulers. We don't want people who rule very harshly or severely. There are different aspects of the Confucian Tao. Now that I think we the can turn to the actual specific details of the Tao itself. I'm going to highlight just a few of them. One has already come up, which is the idea of ritual, though I haven't and tradition as well, though I actually haven't said much about what rituals are. Um, the idea of tradition is inherent to the Confucian conception of the Tao simply because the Tao is something that we inherit by tradition. That's why I read off saying earlier about how Confucius isn't innovating, he's merely transmitting. Ethical cultivation is another part of the Tao. The idea of trying to um, improve ourselves and um, keep our own behavior in line. Happiness as well is another part of the Confucian Tao, personal individual happiness. The family is a huge part of this, and keeping society together is just a crucial part of the Confucian Tao. Uh, there's nothing more there's nothing worth highlighting, I think, more than just the importance of the social fabric. It's not the exclusive focus, but it's always in the background because of what I said earlier about the priorities of Confucius and thinkers generally in the spring and autumn period, which is that something has gone very badly wrong, such that the Zhou dynasty has been forced east by invaders. And so there's always in the background this reflection of like we just aren't living well. What has gone wrong? Now, we inherit the Tao in the form of rituals, or we inherited the Tao from previous sage kings. That's why this is sometimes called the way of the former kings. We inherit this in the form of rituals. It is true that rituals are religious activities or can be religious activities. In English, there's something very odd about using the word ritual. Like rituals tend to be associated with something superstitious, even if they're not overtly religious. The idea of someone like before a big sports game, always having the same meal, they might call that their pre-game ritual. There's nothing overtly religious about that, but there's something kind of superstitious about that. And it is true that in Confucianism, some rituals are overtly religious or superstitious. The idea of offering food and wine to spirits, that is a ritual. Performing a funeral is a ritual. But in reality, Confucian rituals extend incredibly widely. So I'm going to read off Analects 10.2. At court, when speaking with officers of lower rank, he was pleasant and affable. When speaking with officers of upper rank, he was formal and proper. When his lord was present, he combined an attitude of cautious with respect with graceful ease. It's not obvious, by the way, who he is in the passage I just read. I suspect it was either supposed to be Confucius himself, or it's actually just supposed to be a general reflection on the gentleman, this person who um, carries out rituals properly. But what I like about this passage is that it reveals that the Confucian conception of ritual properness or ritual, so sometimes we just call this the virtue of ritual propriety, is actually supposed to extend so widely that it would be like your tone of voice when speaking to someone. So this does actually include like your verbal etiquette. Um, like the when I'm explaining this concept of ritual to students, I might sometimes mention like holding the door open for someone, saying please and thank you. Like these are not enforced by law. And so this gives us the idea of like that the Confucius isn't interested in coercively regulating these practices, but that they're important for keeping society together, even if these are just super small ways. In Analects 12.1, Confucius makes this sound like that rituals just comprise the whole entirety of ethics. So this is 12.1. Yan Hui asked about goodness. The master said, restraining yourself and returning to the rights constitutes goodness. If for one day you manage to restrain yourself and return to the rights, in this way you could lead the entire world back to goodness. The key to achieving goodness lies within yourself. How could it come from others? That's a great passage because it actually combines so many of the ideas that we mentioned. So, for example, certainly the idea of rituals, returning to rituals, even just the verb there, return, illustrates the way that historically successful societies actually practice these, and we just have to get back to them. And that if you managed for one day to restrain yourself and return to the right, so even just for one small day, you could lead the entire world back to goodness. So this is the idea of through Wu Wei, carrying out this in a Wu Wei style without straining yourself and busying yourself with the behaviors of other people, you would actually lead the entire world back to goodness. But there's a reason why it's really, really difficult to carry out with these rituals. So like if I emphasize too much that it's actual that rituals exist even in small practices, whether overtly or not, like offering a sacrifice or overtly religious or not, I mean, whether offering a sacrifice or just saying please and thank you or speaking respectfully, that runs the risk of missing the way that rituals are actually are or can be incredibly demanding. So some of the most famous and controversial have to do with mourning. Confucian funerals are incredibly elaborate. There are multiple coffins for someone who's died, an inner coffin and an outer coffin. You're burying the person with incredibly opulent garments and other goods, and that's followed by a very long period of ritualized mourning. So I'm going to read off to you. I'm going to read off to you one more passage about this. So this is Analects 14.40. Ji Shang asked, the book of documents says Gao Zong stayed in his mourning hut and did not speak for 3 years. What does this mean? The master, Confucius replied, we do not have to confine ourselves to Gaozong. All of the ancients were the same. When their lord passed away for 3 years, the 100 officials would all see to their own tasks under the direction of the prime minister. This passage mentions a 3 year long mourning period after someone has died, during which you'd have to basically isolate yourself and keep silent. Um, and Confucius is a big fan of this practice. Um, he talks about this in Analects 17.21. The way that the 3 year mourning period is a common practice throughout the world. And it's supposed to mirror the way that as children we are completely dependent upon our parents for the first 3 years of our lives. So when they die, we basically need to mourn them and shut ourselves off from the world for 3 years. Of course, this is an incredibly demanding thing, and it tells us something about just how much these rituals are asking of us. Um, there are very like Confucianism had tons of critics in this respect. Even in the spring and autumn period, there's another thinker, Mozi or Moza, who founds this school of philosophy, Moism. And the Moists are deeply critical of all these practices related to Confucian funerals and other Confucian practices too, involving music and that are similarly opulent. And they just consider them wasteful. Like, why are you wasting all this money on burying a dead person when you could be using that money on poor people who are alive now? The answer for Moism, right, is that we have to care about everyone equally, and so then we have to spend our money on poor people, even if they're strangers to us. Whereas Confucianism, especially the philosophy of that Mencius develops, that is a strand of Confucianism, focuses on like, well, look, I have special obligations to people in virtue of the different roles that they play in my life or played in my life. And that you see that brought out in the reasoning from Analect 17.21, when Confucius is like, look, we just owe this mourning period to our parents because of the way they took care of us for 3 years when we were a kid. When you carry this out, when you carry out the rituals properly, you that's when you develop the virtue of ritual propriety, and that's just the word propriety is just the English noun meaning something like properness. The rituals also play the role of actually helping you develop virtues. There is something to be said for the way that habituation or habit formation plays a role in Confucian philosophy. Therefore, in at least this respect, it's somewhat similar to Aristotle's philosophy in the West. Aristotle develops a theory of ethics whereby a huge set of the virtues are called character virtues. They're not all virtues fall into this box, but many, many, many do. And we develop virtues by habituation, by trying to basically make something like second nature to us. We by repeated activity we engage in repeated activity by means of which we ultimately develop virtues, even if they feel very foreign to us at start. Confucius definitely would never say that the virtues are truly foreign to us. Um, but he is aware that because of various temptations, it's hard for us to practice some of these, and we just have to keep practicing and practicing and practicing. But like when you're playing an instrument, or learning to play an instrument, you can actually make this second nature to you. Or playing a sport, for example, is a similar thing. And the rituals are actually these time-honored ways of regulating our impulses and desires. That's something that the later Confucian philosopher Junzi makes a lot of. Earlier, when I was talking about the way the Tao is conceived of as like a path or a way of life, I mentioned that Shunzi thought of earlier sage kings as leaving signs for us. These signs actually take the form of rituals, and they're helping us live well. They're helping us bring our natural born impulses in line with what society requires. And Shunzi is less optimistic than many other Confucian philosophers about what our nature is. He thinks that our nature is actually bad and that we use rituals to sort of shape it and warp it into something good. You don't have to be a Confucian. You don't have to think of human nature that way if you're a Confucian. Mencius thought human nature was good and that we have to use rituals basically to water seeds of goodness in us. But the crucial point here is that repeated practice is key. And you might say, well, like, what do these practices look like? What do these lessons look like? And the answer is that they are the rituals. So, since Confucius isn't interested in innovating, and there's this conception, that I mentioned Confucius is having, and Shunzi has it too, where these rituals come down to us from time immemorial, and we basically know that these rituals work because these past societies were actually successful, and it's only when people began to deviate from the rituals that that society began to experience real problems. You might ask, okay, like, are these rituals, can they be changed? Are we ever allowed, are they flexible in some way? And they are actually flexible in some respect. And so to get at this idea, I'll read off 9.3. The master, Confucius, said, a ceremonial cap made from linen is prescribed by the rites, but these days people use silk. This is frugal, and I follow the majority. To bow before ascending the stairs is was prescribed by the rites, but these days people bow after ascending. This is arrogant, and though it goes against the majority, I continue to bow before ascending. So, what this passage is saying is that the linen cap that you needed in ceremony in ancient China, which would be governed by ritual, right? That's why he's talking about it's being prescribed by ritual. But this ceremonial cap was made of linen, and it was incredibly intricate. There was the stitching was very detailed. There were tons of layers. And Confucius's contemporaries had begun replacing it with a very simple silk version of the cap. And Confucius thinks of it as basically not interfering with the basic function. You need to cover your hair respectfully in the ritual. It doesn't really matter that it's not that like the stitching is less intricate and detailed. But and so he's happy and content to just do what other people are doing and use a silk cap instead of the intricate linen one. But there's this other ritual where people would have to ascend the stairs when approaching a ruler or a superior who would be sitting on a raised dais. Ritual dictated bowing before ascending the stairs, but many of Confucius's contemporaries had taken to ascending the stairs and only bowing when right before their ruler. Now, this is a very substantial change to the ritual because the when you bow below, you're asking permission, right? You're implying permission to ascend. But when you're bowing above, you're saying, well, hey, I already did it. I'm presumed that I was given permission and that I'm bowing now just as a simple bit of deference to you, but not with the same level of invitation, not with the same in like asking for permission, right? I've already come up here, and I'm just bowing as a way of saying hi respectfully. So Confucius is okay with changing the cap, the linen cap, because that preserves the spirit of the ritual. But he's not okay with the bowing one because that changes the spirit of the ritual. It isn't about the size of the change that matters. It's about whether the spirit is being preserved. And the spirit isn't preserved in the bowing one. This also reveals to us that like we're really focused, like these rituals are not particularly special in themselves, but it's about what they signify and the way that what they signify helps keep society together. Confucius is still very conservative, though, and I'm not trying to deny that. He is a reactionary thinker in a sense that society's gone badly. We need to get back to the way things were done before. There's nothing super special about the way things that were done before, but we know that they work. We know that this way worked, so let's go back to it. On the other hand, There are times clearly when he's okay with some change and innovation, but notice that he's not the innovator here, right? He's not innovating. He's just following the majority. If the majority still kept in line with this ceremonial cap that was traditional and linen and intricate, he'd probably be working with that one too. Still. There's too much to say about Confucianism to actually do justice to the whole philosophy in one episode, but I think it's worth highlighting one other idea, which is the role that family plays here. I've already alluded to the idea of it when talking about the mourning period following the death of a parent. That happens specifically in virtue of the special role that parents play in our lives. And it's generally not surprising that a thinker who emphasized the role of tradition would also place great importance on the family. One way that the family is super important for Confucianism is that the family is the place where we begin to acquire the virtues. So let me read off to you Analects 1 2. This is the speaker here is a Confucian follower, Master Yu. And Master Yu says, a young person who is filial and respectful of his elders rarely becomes the kind of person who is inclined to defy his superiors, and there has never been a case of one who is disinclined to defy his superiors, stirring up rebellion. The gentleman applies himself to the roots. Once the roots are firmly established, the way will grow. Might we not say that that filial piety and respect for elders constitute the root of goodness? Filial piety being the relevant virtue here of honoring your family and showing them just deference and respect in the right way. That means oftentimes we have to treat like our sister different from our brother and our brother different from our parents and so on. But the idea is that the virtue that you have when you do all of that right, when you carry out these responsibilities correctly, that is filial piety. And this passage says that filial piety and respect for elders are the root of goodness, that when firmly established, the way, the Tao will grow. And the idea is that if a young person is trained to be respectful of his elders, he's going to grow up in society to be someone who doesn't defy his superiors. And if someone doesn't defy their superiors, they're not going to stir up rebellion. So family plays this important role here of being the training ground for the virtues. So it's by loving your family and being loved by them correctly that we learn to be kind to other people, and that we learn to respect the right sort of boundaries. The boundaries that the deference we show our elders is at least analogous to the deference we show our superiors in society, even if we owe different things to our rulers than to our grandparents, but still they're analogous. As well, one other important part of the family is this idea of differentiated love, which again becomes much more important in Mencius than in Confucius's Analects itself. But the great differentiated love is the way that we owe special responsibilities to people that we don't owe to other people, right? We, for example, owe our parents one thing and our siblings another and strangers a third thing. We don't treat everyone the same. That's like very controversial in ancient Chinese philosophy. The Maoists really are much more committed egalitarians, where they think that just as heaven rains on the poor and the rich alike, and heaven rains on our strangers and loved ones alike, so too should we follow in those footsteps and treat everyone the same. For Confucianism, that's really not true, and that's because they believe that part of the social glue, some of the things keeping society together, are the special respect that we have for family, hence the virtue of filial piety. ultimately, the Confucian Tao is one that's incredibly regimented. It is very hard to find some amount of flexibility here, and certainly, and even if there might be some flexibility, it's certainly hard to find spontaneity in the Confucian Tao. That eventually we'll have another episode where we talk about the way Taoists criticize Confucianism for exactly this reason. They don't have that their idea of the Tao puts everything and everyone into boxes and tries to regiment everything. But Confucius thinks that's the right way to live, that too much has been made of a free, liberated life of where one has been freed specifically of social norms. That's the chaos that led to the downfall of the not exactly the downfall, but it does eventually turn into a downfall. But the movement of the Zhou dynasty from the west to the east, that's what led to their defeat at the hands of these invaders from the west, these Western invaders. And for that reason, that might be one of the most important things to highlight about Confucianism. Of course, we do care about the details. What are rituals? Why do they matter? What are the virtues? How does filial piety figure into a good life and other ancient Chinese philosophical debates? But the big picture of the Confucian Tao is one that's incredibly rule governed and regimented. These rules are about your own self development, your own self cultivation, but just as importantly, and maybe even way more importantly, as I think it is a way more important thing, the Confucian Tao was about keeping the fabric of society together. And that's why some of the most illustrative rituals from 21st century life are things like saying please and thank you and holding the door open for people. Um, These are modern day rituals. They're thankfully not as onerous as some of the more onerous Confucian ones, about 3 year mourning periods. But we have onerous and demanding rituals too, things we ask of and expect of each other, especially in the context of familial relationships and romantic relationships. There is so much more to say about this subject, and we'll have to come back to Confucianism in future episodes. But I think that this suffices for this episode and for our look at what the Confucian Tao is. Thank you.